Another kind of decent one was WS Scanner that came out about a year ago. This is great and everything, but it only supports .NET Web Services, so you're kind of screwed with anything else.
So I have clients who use other technologies, don't you?
Yeah, I kind of do. So this is kind of an example just showing you where all these gaps are, and it gets frustrating when you're in a pen test and you're trying to use these tools. You run into these roadblocks, and roadblocks is what we're trying to get around.
Yeah, so our current process for pen testing web services prior to this talk was to basically use SoapUI, which is really just a QA tool. The recent versions have included things like some security features, but when I looked at the interface, it was kind of difficult to use or just didn't make sense to me. So I was like, all right, well, I'll just sort of go off and do whatever. But SoapUI, and then what we would do is to use Burp Suite as a web application proxy. So since it speaks HTTP, beautiful. We'll just use SoapUI and have SoapUI use Burp Suite as a proxy, bootstrap our HTTP post request, and then use the intruder, and then just teach Burp Suite about web application or web services testing.
Yeah, I wanted to mention Ken Johnson. He did some really good work around this area. He's got a great article. I definitely recommend everybody checking this out. He's basically taken the functionality of Burp Suite. He's written some Ruby scripts and put them into Burp, so you can kind of do the SoapUI functionality within Burp now, which is really cool. But it kind of goes to show, we've got to write our own custom stuff like this, and this takes time, billable hours, and it just really sucks.
A lot of people in the industry who are pen testers are not really, awesome coders, right? And not everybody's going to be an awesome coder, and that's fine. So at the end of the day, we need to look to alternative approaches to improving our testing process because, writing code takes time and/or not everybody has that type of skill. So to get the job done, we gotta approach the problem a little bit differently. So here's just a couple screenshots of using SoapUI, and this is just a simple request. And then from there, what we'll do is we'll set up the proxy, localhost 8080, and we would use Burp Suite to intercept that request. And then from there, we can use the intruder to do fuzz testing against the web service. So here's just a simple example of a public web service, and we're just sending, some information, and then from there you would just leverage the intruder or the repeater to replay this request, do some fuzzing, looking at interesting parameters here, and then
you would never fuzz a public web service, would you?
Oh, absolutely not. Definitely not.
So, now going into kind of testing environments for web services. So I got this awesome new tool, this script. I've done a lot of work here. Where do I test this thing? Do I test it on a public web service?
Production environment.
Or production environment? That's awesome. That's not illegal or anything, right? Or just build my own testing environment, right? I'll do that during the pen test, right?
How good are you at coding?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a big gap here. I think WebGoat had a little web service component at one point, but I don't really know anyone that uses it or if it was that good to begin with. So we kind of started with ground zero here, and we want to provide some value around how can we do this in a good testing environment that's open source and contribute it back to the community. And if you ever see an online pregnancy test, yeah. What the hell is that, right?
Fail.
So what are we going to do about all this? We've seen a lot of problems here. There's problems with pretty much everything. So, of course, keep calm and make soap. So what we're doing is we're taking the information from the OWASP testing guide version 3, and we've completely revised it with the newest technology that's out there for web services, and we are contributing this back to OWASP for the testing guide in version 4 that right now is under development. The big thing that we're changing is from a high level, I want to keep that in mind, from a high level we are aligning that with the PTES, which is the Penetration Testing Execution Standard. So if you don't know what that is, it's a large project that's going on right now in the security community, led by guys like Chris Nickerson and others that are really trying to define what a penetration test is. So getting away from the vulnerability assessment versus a pen test.
A pen test is not a vulnerability scan. A vulnerability scan is not a pen test.
Right. But setting standards around this so you can take this to clients, take this to customers, whoever, and they'll know what a pen test is. And it really helps define a methodology for any type of pen test, which is very important, especially when we're talking about web services because they are so complex. So breaking this down from a high level, obviously our white paper that we'll have links to at the end has the full excruciating detail that you can go through. But it really starts with the pre-engagement interactions, which is your scoping questions and goals, defining what type of assessment this is, and of course your rules of engagement.
Do you have web services? That should be a question.
For any type of web app engagement, exactly. Intelligence gathering, so this is where you're going to define your WSDLs, you're going to enumerate those WSDLs, you're going to look at WS security controls that may be in place or may not be in place, authentication credentials, sample SOAP requests, and identifying those awesome web service interfaces, which Jabber is going to be talking about in a second.
There will be exploits.
Yep. And that's something that gets overlooked a lot by pen testers, and the clients, of course. The other important phase here is the threat modeling. So asking the client, looking at the application, looking at the web services and saying what is most valuable from a business perspective. If there's credit card information going through those web services, you're damn right that's important, and that's something that you're going to have to test for.
And talking with developers is probably the best way to get a really good understanding of the threat model, right? So understanding the business is critical, but then talking with the developers, how did you implement this thing? How did you build security into this web service? I got to understand how you did it, because that's the only way, in some cases, that we can provide assurance that it's even close to good.
And when you're doing your pen test, you want to outline a realistic attack vector. So a web service that's only used internally versus one that's accessible on the public internet is going to have a completely different threat model, and you need to define that ahead of time. Next up, we got vulnerability analysis. So this is where we're going to actually do our testing. We're going to do the authentication testing, transport layer, web service interface management testing, and analyze client-side applications, which we'll talk about in a little bit, like Microsoft Silverlight, that interface with web services. And then, of course, the fun part, right? Exploitation. So we're going to do our content level testing. We're going to be fuzzing. You may want to use Jabbra's new Metasploit MSF Web Fuzz module, which we'll talk about. And, of course, doing replaying, man-in-the-middle testing, and then Beeple, which we have a whole slide on Beeple, right? Then once you have shell, hopefully you do have shell, because you can get shell through a web service, which Jabber will demonstrate. You want to prepare and document, and, of course, reporting at the end of the day.
Reporting is the necessary part.
It sucks, but we got to do it, right? So scoping. This is a big piece that I want to spend some time on. This is critical, absolutely critical when we're talking about testing web services. These are the types of questions you need to ask. So things like determining what type of framework. So WCF, Apache Access, Zend. You have to know that to start off with. The types of services. Do they use REST, SOAP? What type of data? Provide all those WSDL endpoints and paths. We need to have that in advance to do the testing properly. What type of authentication does it use? We find that some clients are setting up this, strange custom authentication, and if you don't know that ahead of time, you're going to be in a bind once you start figuring out how that web service works. Definitely have the client provide multiple SOAP requests in advance, showing the full functionality so you can do your testing and you're not wasting time trying to figure out all that stuff on your own.
So without a sample web service request, in many cases, what you would often get is a WSDL. And the WSDL just says, here are the functions, and here's roughly what the data would look like. But you actually want to be able to make valid requests and see what valid responses would look like. And then look at the invalid requests, right? So you want to see both, right? So understanding that if we have a sample web service request, that'll be super useful when we're actually doing the pen test. All right, so now when we're doing fingerprinting, right, we're going to go off and try to enumerate where are those web services on the internet. So ASMF, Microsoft Technologies, but there are also tons of others. And the WSDL, right? The WSDL is what you actually would specify. It's sort of like the data definition for communicating with a SOAP web service. This is just, as I said previously, it defines all the methods and all the different types of values that would be passed to this web service. From there, you can also look at, using things like Shodan. And Google to do this enumeration.
Shodan is awesome.
Yeah, Shodan is awesome. It's so much win. Definitely makes reconnaissance really, really easy, especially when you're looking at web applications or web services reconnaissance. It's definitely the primary method that I would use.
And something that kind of gets overlooked now, Microsoft Silverlight is kind of a newer technology, and we're just starting to see a lot of research coming out about, around the security of Silverlight. But I'll talk about this in a second. But Silverlight, the ZAP files, if you search for those in Google, they're usually tied to web services. So you can look at the client-side app and then see where those services are exposed and then go from there.
Yep. Okay, so here are some of the results. We just did a quick Google search take a look at this. I mean, this is right now on the internet. This is pretty much what we found. So, it's definitely out there. And if, as an industry, we're not really good at pen testing it, it's pretty much like, all right, well, there's some risk there. So here's Tom's password, because one of the things that we've basically seen is that in the industry, weak default and reuse passwords, from my point of view, is most organizations, that's their biggest risk, right? So when you think of when you go in to do an internal pen test, pass the hashes is a nice example. You crack one Windows system, reuse the password, you'll probably compromise the entire domain. So that's one thing that we've seen as a very useful vector. So I did some research last year on SAP Business Objects, and they had a default username and password, and we were able to get shell on this box. So that was through a web services management interface, right? So thinking about not just the web service, not just the web application, but also the other interfaces that control that stuff, right? So some of the developers may not even be logging in to these web management interfaces because they may not need to. If the security guy doesn't know about it and the developer doesn't use it, well, it's still there and it's a huge risk in the industry. And if it's a documented username and password, the attackers can, they can do a quick Google search and find this stuff. So we need to be able to translate that into a Metasploit module or something else and basically demonstrate that risk.
Yeah, developers really, talking with them, they have no idea that these web service interfaces are out there. So they're actually kind of surprised when we make this a finding, and they're like, oh my God, we left this wide open, and it's kind of shocking. So. Yeah,
access to, exposed on the internet with default credentials is code execution. So, All right, so one of the things that I'm going to be talking about for this year is Oracle Glassfish, which is something similar to Tomcat Manager and JBoss and Access 2. It's basically like Access 2, which is for handling and deploying web services, but there's tons more functionality there, right? So it runs on a unique port, which is 4848. And the idea here was that if you took the same approach that we've been taking to Tomcat Manager and Access 2 and apply that to Glassfish, potentially we could get shell through this application because it does allow for the ability to deploy a malicious web or a web service. So we could just deploy a malicious one if we could get authenticated to the application or maybe bypass authentication. So in the industry, one of the things that we've seen is that there was a documented CVE, which is a known authentication bypass for earlier versions of Oracle Glassfish. So there's, Oracle had, previously they had purchased Sun, and what Sun had was, it was 2.x and Sun Application Server 9.x. So there were the earlier versions, and also it affects Glassfish 3.x. So those were the earlier versions that the authentication bypass affects. But in the later version, 3.1, there was also a default username and password. So it's admin blank password, right? So as an industry, we've seen from SQL Server, SA, 2011, and we're still seeing that sort of stuff. So as an industry, it's gone across the board, multiple organizations. They're documented, so they're public. So how do we find this sort of stuff? Using Shodan. We're good enough. You just type in Glassfish, about 1,400 systems on the internet. So it's definitely out there, so something to be aware of. And it was documented. So it was documented functionality. So from that perspective, it's not really ODay because there is no patch. There probably won't be a patch because there's nothing they can really do about it. We just needed to make sure that the security community was aware of, you can get shell on this box, if you have this documented, admin blank password.
Of course, once you have shell and you have access to the internet server, you can gain access to all that data.
Well, this is
going to the web service.
This is the system that's going to be running the web services. So if we just do a packet capture, we're going to be able to get all that customer data anyway. There's not a lot of work there. All this web services stuff and the SOAP and communicating with XML, that's really hard and a lot of work. So somebody who's just like, all right, I just want to demonstrate some risk really, really easily, the script kiddies of the world or, whatever it is, or even doing a vuln scan. You could probably pick this up in a vuln scan, so relatively easy to do. And then from there, the client needs to understand that risk. So I worked with a couple other guys on this from the Metasploit team and some contributors. So from here, we got the exploit working really, really beautifully. So if you guys want to try it, right now, it's already in the Metasploit SVN. It does version detection for you, and then it does the best type of approach first, and then it will walk down from there. So on Glassfish 3.1, you have default credentials. For the earlier versions, 3.0 or Sun